If you go to our lab website, this is our lab website. It's orthogonalresearch.weebly.com. And if you go to people in collaboration, you'll see these tabs: simulating biology, neuro AI, open science, open source, and informatics. And so these are different groups and projects that we have linked from our main page. So we go to neuro AI, which is something that is sort of a catch-all term for what's going on here. It's kind of our approach to neuro AI. I have cognition futures under there, which is more about cognitive science. We talk a lot about, bleeds over into cybernetics. We talk a lot about agent cognition and other things like that in cognition futures. But we also have this group, Representational Brains and Phenotypes, and I'm going to go to that website. So the way I have the groups in the lab is they all have their own website, or we try to get them, different websites. And the reasoning behind that is partially because we started out with DevoWorm, kind of separate from Orthogonal Lab, and then it kind of got integrated in. But we also then, want to have kind of every group have its own identity within the lab. So this is Representational Brains and Phenotypes. This is sort of an illustration of what we're thinking about, these very simple models of cognition, of embodied intelligence, of those sorts of things, and building little toy models that can simulate those, simulate some sort of intelligent behavior. So we're not interested necessarily in things like large language models or machine learning models. We're interested in agent models, and not even really agent-based models. This is going a little bit beyond agent-based models, where you have agents that are sometimes embodied, sometimes they're not. They have an internal model where they have these representations, and it's the representations we're interested in. We might put them into a population. Oftentimes we're using something like genetic algorithms to, breed different populations of agents. Sometimes we're using embodied cognition principles where the agents have sensory inputs and they have effectors and they're doing things in the world, and it's continually updating that internal representation. Sometimes they're very abstract representations, like our contextual geometric structures, and you see here kind of a reference to that. You'd have to read the paper to understand what's going on there, but basically those are quasi-embodied models that have these categories that where if you encounter something in the world, you categorize it in a certain way, and then you have this population of agents where you build a cultural representation of those things. So that's what we have. And then if we go to the interest areas, which is this tab up here, we have a couple of different subcategories for this group. So we have cultural computational modeling, growth and form, cybernetics and complexity, and agentive systems. So we go to cultural computational modeling. This is something that involves what we call contextual geometric structures. So there were a number of pieces of work that were done on that, papers, conference presentations, and other things. And then, of course, I worked with Hrishikesh Kulkarni, and this was quite a while back now. This was before the pandemic, where we did a couple of papers on sort of using data science and machine learning to look at cultural things. And so this is, and then of course we have things that we presented at the Cultural Evolution Conference. And so there's a cultural evolution dimension to this as well. And so that's all kind of in this subheading. The idea here is that we build these cultural representations, very broadly defined. We usually have populations of agents, and they're not. It's not like a agent-based model where they have strict rules of interaction. A lot of times they live in a population, which means that they have common inheritance. There's mutation, there's recombination, there's reproduction, and then you have evolution over time. So a lot of times, we'll have maybe a population of 50 agents, and they'll all start with very similar representations because they are all part of the same small population. We might expand that where we have replication of the agents. And then, it might expand the population to maybe 1,000 agents. And then we have different things that happen to the representations over time as they reproduce. Sometimes they mutate. So sometimes we might have like a genetic algorithmic representation where we have things on an artificial chromosome, and we can mutate different parts of that representation, change them in a very targeted way. Sometimes we have recombination where things get recombined across agents or across parts of the representation. So, that's an important part of cultural evolution, is this recombination process. You have transmission where things are transmitted from one agent to another or from one generation to another. So if there's a replication event, the descendants all get things from the parent. And it's very much a computer science problem as well as a genetics problem. So this is, but we're thinking about this in terms of cultural evolution, where you might inherit ideas or you learn ideas from an elder or from a parent. So these are all things that, we kind of build cultural representations with a certain level of abstraction, or we've also done work where we've looked at different things going on with, like, in data sets of books or in some psychological phenomena. So that's cultural computational modeling. We haven't really been as active in that recently, but it's something that we have an interest in. And there's this thing, growth and form. So this is a subgroup. This is where we do work on what we call computational critical periods and morphogenesis, proprioception, and soft materials. So computational critical periods and this morphogenesis, proprioception, and soft materials, these are links. Actually, this is a link to a Discord chat, and this is a link to actually one publication. This is the publication that I did with Richard Gordon and Jesse, and this was published in 2023. This was Embodied Cognitive Morphogenesis is a Route to Intelligent Systems. So we have this this work in sort of the area of agent morphogenesis, which is where we develop and grow agents using different methods. So it's very much tied into DevoWorm. It's very much a developmental approach, but it's this idea that you're evolving cognition and the body together, or you're rather developing it. It's actually maybe a more accurate way to put it, because there is some evolutionary aspects to it, but it's largely a developmental process that we're simulating. So this is a paper on different methods for doing this. But we also have, and I'm going to go to the publications for this group because that's where everything is. All sorts of different types of experiments and different sort of approaches that kind of develop for posters and for different white papers. So, thinking about development and how to model development, there is this work that was done over a series of Dynamics Days conferences where I looked at the modeling of heterochrony, or changes that unfold over time in development, where you control the timing and you control the rate. And this is something that happens in biology through genetic action, where certain things start growing at a certain time, and then in different species they grow at different times. and they start growing earlier or later depending on how this, you know, how that population ends up evolving. So if something starts growing earlier, that means that maybe you can have a bigger brain, or you can have a bigger structure. That's whatever structure is growing, it gets bigger because it's been growing longer. If it starts later, it doesn't grow as fast and it's smaller in the adult form. And then, of course, you have rate, so you can vary the rate as well. So it might start growing later, but it grows at a faster rate. So all these things have consequences for the adult phenotype, and that's something that we can model mathematically pretty well. And so we can apply that to these developmental agents where you have these developmental processes that you're trying to simulate. We have other types of models. We also have these phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This is something that just came out in the embodied cognition proceedings, where we're thinking about how we can evolve different agent phenotypes using the principles of phylogenetics. That means that we're thinking about what things are shared between lineages of agents, common ancestry, and what kinds of things evolve sort of in parallel. And so this is more of like, how do we evolve different agents to do different things, but how do we also generate some sort of quasi-natural diversity amongst agents? In other words, how can we generate a variety of agents to do maybe different types of things? So if you wanted to, say, evolve an agent to do things like open a bottle or open a jar, you would have to evolve a hand that could grip at the right strength and twist. And you could evolve that phenotype and you could optimize it. You could use an evolutionary algorithm and you could optimize it. But you could also, kind of do that process, but do it in a phylogenetic way. And you generate a bunch of variants on that task. So you don't necessarily try to always design things with an eye towards the optimal solution. You generate a lot of diversity, and then you evaluate the diversity. And ultimately, you have much more interesting designs or much more interesting structures than you otherwise would have. And so I don't want to get too much into that, but that's kind of what that's about. We have this paper again, Embodied Cognitive Morphogenesis. Then you have critical periods in developmental neurosimulation. This is the work we've been doing on critical periods. So again, it's about timing and development. Critical periods are periods of time where organisms acquire information. And so a lot of times with critical periods or sensitive periods, an organism will acquire something. And it's, sometimes if they acquire something during that time, has more of an effect on its adult form, or a larger effect on sort of its learned behavior than if you present it at another time. So our visual systems have critical periods early in development where the eyes have to be in place and it has to acquire light, or else certain parts of visual cortex aren't fully developed. And so it's just these periods of time within development where things have to be in place. And this paper kind of goes through some of these scenarios. And then finally, we have this paper on dynamic representations of heterochrony, which I just discussed. So the cybernetics and complexity is actually a big area. This is part of this developmental AI roadmap. And this is where we have a couple of different things going on. We have this area of developmental neurosimulation, and this is where we have our Bradenburg vehicles. So we've really focused on Bradenburg vehicles for the most part got that wrong, but we really focused on developmental Bradenburg vehicles for neurosimulation, building these embodied models, not just the traditional Bradenburg vehicle, which is here, but going from like a single cell or an egg, a Bradenburg egg or a vehicle egg, and then differentiating that egg into different, what they call germ layers, which differentiate into different structures like sensors and effectors, and an internal model, a brain, and then an outside shell, which is the body. And you have these different, these are encoded in a genetic algorithm or some other type of computational representation, and then you allow these things to develop, and then they develop into the adult form. And the idea is you can play around with the timing of things, you can play around with the acquisition of traits, and it has an effect downstream on the cognition of the agent later in life. So you could use this developmental technique to simulate, the different outcomes. So, the phenotype of Bradenberg vehicles, when Bradenberg developed this sort of paradigm, he was thinking about insects, but it was also kind of a toy model. He didn't really think about vehicles as being kind of anything more than kind of a very simple model for cognition. But we're taking this a couple steps further and saying, well, you could develop these embodied phenotypes, and you could put a lot of developmental detail into these simulations, and you could connect that with the adult phenotype and its behavior. So as it's acquiring a phenotype, it's also acquiring behavior. Well, it's happening in development, and that's kind of the idea behind developmental neurosimulation. I have the wrong figures for these papers, but we did a paper on intelligence offloading, and so we did some work on cognitive offloading and intelligence offloading, and these are again the wrong figures for this, but basically offloading is this phenomena where an organism will have some sort of cognitive representation, but instead of storing it in the brain, they store it in the environment. So if you're writing something on a piece of paper, if you're writing notes, that's offloading that knowledge to a notepad. And then you can go back and look at that notepad and recall what you said. So you're offloading some of that capacity to your notepad, and you're bringing that back into your mind, and it's reminding you of things. And it's this form of offloading that is very simple, because offloading can be much more complex. We have things like, artifacts, symbolic artifacts, religious artifacts. Those are all things that sort of are offloaded into the environment. They serve as signals to people to remind them of things or to organize their thoughts. So these are all things. And then we talked about intelligence offloading in terms of these Bradenberg vehicles and other types of models developmentally as well. Then we also have some other things like this was something that Ankit Grover drove forward. He was interested in switching behaviors in cognition, and so we did a presentation on that at Neuromatch Academy. We've done a lot of work on Gibsonian information, which is characterizing information theory in terms of ecological principles or Gibsonian principles, which is basically drawn from ecological psychology and thinking about information as this process of gaining environmental structure and things like motion and other types of spatiotemporal information, and then integrating that in an agent. And then we just talked about embodiment and development a lot, and this is sort of all the work that we've been doing on neurosimulation. We also have allostasis machines, and I think Vidi asked me for that one of these papers, as I sent the copy that I have to her. So allostasis machines is this idea that we create a simple model of allostasis. And allostasis is this phenomena where we have multiple stable states. And we have a system that moves between those stable states. And it has to find them in a dynamical environment. So as you know, homeostasis is where you have a simple model of equilibrium where you perturb the system and it returns to the target, right? It's like your body temperature, because you're homeothermic, you always have a constant body temperature. Sometimes you have a fever, sometimes you become hypothermic, and that core temperature drops, but it always returns to an equilibrium point. In allostasis, you have multiple set points, and oftentimes after you get perturbed or you experience a perturbation, that state drifts around but it finds a new stable state. So that's what an allostasis machine is. It's where an agent goes through the world and it's experiencing the world dynamically, and it has some sort of state readout that is constantly changing and shifting, and it's always trying to find stable states. So it's always returning to some baseline, but there are multiple baselines. And the idea is that you can have this sort of, so it's very strong from dynamical cognition, which we've talked about, where the system is always trying to find stable states given this sort of inherent perturbation-filled world. So that's kind of the idea, and then we've just kind of had a couple of papers on that. We presented at SIGCHI and at the BICA conference, and so these are the publications. And then finally, we have this MetaBrain models approach, and this is mostly Jesse and myself worked on this, and this is where we have these neural representations at multiple layers, and so the layers refer to different levels of abstraction or of representation. So if you think about neural networks, they're practically representation free, meaning that they don't really have a high degree of like symbolic representation to them. They just process data, you get a weight matrix, and that's it. A symbolic model, on the other hand, has a very high degree of symbolic representation, but a very low degree of sort of statistical representation. And so we array those things in sort of layers, and the layer, so something will be processed at one layer and then selectively passed on to the next layer, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of like different layers in neocortex or different parts of the brain where you're processing in with one sort of at one level of representation, and then you move down to the next layer and so forth. So this is like it kind of grew out of this idea of the neurosymbolic model, where you're combining sort of neural networks in symbolic models. But it's much more flexible, and we've actually talked about this in the context of agent-based modeling and in developmental agents. So this is very much tied to all the other stuff we're doing. Then finally, we have the agentive systems. These are things where we've been thinking about this idea of intelligent agents, and actually we've kind of clustered some open source sustainability stuff under this, but it's kind of its own thing, where we're thinking about intelligence augmentation and intelligent agents and super performance and things like that.